What's good, everybody? It's your boy O'Shea Duke Jackson, back at it again with another collaboration here on the YouTube channel, guys. And today, backed by popular demand, the one, the only, I will let him tell you who he is. Go ahead, brother.
Thanks, man. Dr. T.S. Johnson, founder of the Institute for Black Male Studies, associate professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State, and I am the host of the Onyx Report here on YouTube. So thanks for having me, man.
No problem. Give him a round of applause, editor. All right, now definitely thank our brother for being here. And the last time we were collaborating, which was like about last week, we did a wonderful episode on the passing of Kevin Samuels and the demonization of him and Black men. But as the conversation progressed, you made a statement that referred to the fact that many Black men have some ill will towards their father, and that ill will towards their father may be misplaced because of some form of treachery or lies.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you say that?
Well, at the time when we were talking about Kevin, and one of the things that I noticed is some of the ire, some of the frustration coming at Kevin from both men and women was so intense. And what many men reported to me is that the conversation would stray from critiquing Kevin and become about critiquing Black men in general. And so one of the things I pointed out is that for many, Kevin represented a father figure, in terms of, how he engaged people. For women, he engaged them as a father, especially if they didn't have one, and gave direction. And if they got rude, he'd chastise them like a father. But even for men that would reach out to him, he'd give them direction. He'd tell them what they should be doing at different ages. So this is a fathering role that we see with key Black men. We see it with pastors. We see it with certain entertainers. But there are roles that Black men end up playing that are father oriented, and that many of us look to. If you talk about anything from Farrakhan to Martin Luther King to Malcolm, these are all father figures. And we're talking about a nation of people who has not really had the luxury of the father image in their own homes, most particularly since the 1960s and 70s. So it becomes that much more dire for us to find that father. And Kevin really came across to a lot of people as a father. So the intensity of the rage and the frustration, when you really listen to a lot of it, there was a lot of rage at the father as an idea.
Where does this rage at the father as an idea, where does it stem from?
Well, I think the biggest transition is in the Black community. I mean, most of us in the manosphere, we've talked about this ad nauseum. The Black community was married to the greatest extent, prior to the 1960s. And then, by the time we get to now, we're one of the least married communities. That transition, historically speaking, is in a relatively short period of time. Much of it was brought about by policy, the influence of policy, most particularly family court policy. Divorce policy, child support, alimony, so on and so forth, those policies. And, we can tie in other things like welfare and so on and so forth, employment issues, but really the family court and reproductive opportunities that women mainly got more so than men, I think played a critical role in shaping the Black family. And what it's meant for the Black family since the 60s and 70s has been in many ways the absence of the father. So, yeah.
What do you mean when you say reproductive opportunities?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about, there's an article that I wrote, a blog piece that I put out a few years ago on my own blog. It's called Why Was Black Generation X Fatherless? And in it, one of the things I talked about, among many, is that the pill, for example, had a huge impact, most particularly on women. I mean, it gave them complete, kind of control over their biology. If they have over 35 different types of birth control and 5 major forms, and none of that even included abortion. But men are still operating with many of the same options we've had since the 1950s. You got a piece of rubber, you got abstinence, you got the pull-out method. It's like we're lighting fires with sticks, and they're over there using, lighters and all kinds of lasers. But that's the dynamic we have in place. So when she had that much control over her biology, that shifted how the Black family is even produced, how it's conceptualized. You started to hear young women saying things like, I don't need a man. I can raise a family on my own. And she can now more accurately pick and choose who she wants to have a baby from. Now, we can argue about whether or not her decision is the best one, but she can choose it. It doesn't have to just be a result of an accident. Whereas men, again, outside of that piece of rubber or a vasectomy, you're at the whim of really her. You know what I mean? So women got a lot more control over what families they wanted to produce, way more than men. I mean, for our biggest control is abstinence. Yeah.
Let me kind of get back to one of the key things that you said, because a lot of black men had a certain disdain for their father. I was lucky enough to, my parents were, married for some time and then divorced, and I was able to know him, and my mother was never the kind of lady to turn me against my dad. But I do have several friends, unfortunately, who the mother, either lied or kept moving so the dad couldn't, find out where they were, or, was accepting child support from the dad and saying that telling the child that the dad never wanted to see the child, and so there was this animosity. And you said that a lot of black men had a lot of animosity towards their fathers until they became fathers. And then they realized that once they went to the child support court, that they were going through the same experience as them, well, as their fathers may have went or have previously went. Why did you make that exceptional point?
Well, again, that article I wrote, Why Was Generation X Fatherless? I actually wrote it for Generation X black men who have antipathy toward their fathers. I wrote it so that they would reconsider, because the games that were run on black men in the 60s and 70s was new at that time. Just like the games we're experiencing now, we're still trying to figure them out. But 30 years from now, the stuff we're trying to figure out are going to be normalized. They're going to be everyday experiences. In the 60s and 70s, these new policies hit many a black man by surprise, and many didn't know what to do. So in that piece, when I was talking to Generation X black men, one of the things I was saying is our marriage rate is lower than it was in the 70s. It's been a steady decline, meaning that many of us were grappling with the same situations our fathers went through, but not understanding that what we're dealing with, I don't care if you're talking about an ex-wife that's dragging you through family court, or who's falsely accused you of something, or any of that. And I talk to men on a regular basis that have gone through these experiences. These experiences were tried out first on our fathers. So one of the things we have to really do at some point is to step back and look at it and say, wait a minute, all right, how much of this is the narrative I've been using over and over again? Because remember, as Generation X, we were the generation that first started talking about the deadbeat dad. When you look at the Tupacs and, the various rappers, we talked about our fathers not being there. We talked about Dear Mama. We talked about, the mothers that sacrificed and left and were left alone. And that narrative came out of Generation X particularly, but our marriage rates continue to decline, right? Even though we found out much later in the last number of years that black fathers are actually some of the most interactive, but we're not in the home, we're not married. The point I'm getting at is these transitions didn't start. They weren't used on us first. They were used on our fathers first. And when I wrote that article, my father read it and shed tears, because it was the first time he understood what he experienced, and it was coming from his son who was explaining it. So it brought us to a whole nother level. And so I talk about men actually sitting down with their fathers, even if you don't know him, if you've never met him, if you get a chance to sit down with him and get the story. Because even for those of us whose mothers didn't try to denigrate our fathers, you're still only getting the story from her vantage point.
Right.
She doesn't have to be evil, but it's still her vantage point. And when you sit down with your father and get the other side, I mean, you hear what people used to say all the time, there's his side, her side, and the truth. But if you don't have his side, what are you really working with? You're trying to extrapolate the truth from just what she told you. So at some point, you got to sit down with the father. There's a brother who played in the last, oh goodness, what's the name of that movie? The Superfly remake. He played the villain in the movie. The young guy. He's been in the news. I think he might be in jail at this point. He was arrested for various sexual capers that weren't that hot. But I did a show on him last year because he came out on social media and he talked about how much his mother had lied about his wife. And he told a story, and I'll send you the video, but he told a story about meeting his father for the first time and telling his father what he was told growing up. His father, if I remember correctly, basically brought over a box of letters and receipts for money that he had sent, for letters that he had sent, all the things his mother had lied about. And so I'm saying, metaphorically speaking, there's a lot of brothers who have a father that has a box of receipts and you never got to him to find out what's in it. And maybe it's time to do that.
Let's kind of go back to the 60s and the 70s. And I know that this might be a difficult question to pose, but for some brothers out there that, maybe in Generation X or maybe closer to the millennial generations like myself, why were our fathers or our Black men at that particular time? What were the reasons? Because we know that they were leaving the homes for whatever reason. What were some of the underlying reasons why our Black men were leaving the house or leaving families?
I think and this is a huge generalization, but one of the biggest issues, one of the most impactful things to hit us is that Black men were made disposable, more so, especially within our own families. I mean, again, if the average woman could look to institutions to replace men with, that's a hell of a point. You know what I mean? So whether you're talking about welfare, the man in the house rule, which meant she couldn't get it unless there was no man present, whether you're talking about college access and access to white collar employment, especially in the 70s when you had a time period where Black men were going through deindustrialization. We weren't focusing on college. We were focusing on blue collar jobs because you could get them earlier and you could still make good money. I mean, my grandfather and my father, these were men that came out of an era where, they could drop out of school in 6th grade and start working. And this was actually something that was pretty consistent with Black men, especially in the South. You dropped out of elementary school, middle school, maybe even high school, and you went to work. This is why you had such big Black Southern families with 13 kids. The whole focus on that was about work. And the idea was to produce that many kids so that they could help with the farm or not the what do you call it? In terms of bringing in the crops and whatnot, sharecropping. That was the whole purpose around having these large families. And by the time families started to move up north, now all of a sudden you had welfare. Women didn't need to depend on men. It set up a whole new dynamic. And then when you pass that down 3 or 4 generations, women have seen great grandmothers, grandmothers, mothers, now themselves, and their daughters are seeing them do it, where they're heads of household, and men are a resource that they bring in for a period of time. He's enjoying it. He's fun. He's semen. He's temporary protection. When men can be dissected into usable parts that can be disposed and replaced at whim, the very idea of the man or the father becomes irrelevant, becomes something not to be taken seriously. So by the time you get to a Kevin Samuels, again, you have the presentation of the idea of the father. And here's the key to this. Kevin would give advice that they weren't hearing from anybody else. In other words, they were learning about the importance of the father through, even though they've been raised to believe that fathers weren't necessary, but they still couldn't reconcile with that. So what did a lot of women do when they came on Kevin's show? They argued with him. And then you hear some of these women calling back 6 months later, like, you were right, but that was the difficulty. A lot of it was because in our culture, we don't have a respect for the father. That was the principal, that was one of the values of the church going through at least the 1950s. You had the idea of the father. But once that gets dismantled, now you have people that have an antipathy to the father idea, and there's a lot of argument, a lot of disdain, because the fathers in many of our households have been routed out. Women didn't feel the need for it. This is why you got Rebecca Lynn Pope still talking about women running circles around men, even though the data doesn't suggest that. But they can say it because, as far as they're concerned, men are expendable and aren't necessary. And this has been passed on from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter. We're several generations deep into this at this point.
Let me, talk about, or maybe ask you about this, because I grew up, most of my life was in Sacramento, and I lived just like pre the internet. And I think that most Black men, you dated where you could live at that time. And, even going, if you were from other parts of town, like the South Side or something, you didn't want to even go over there because it was too dangerous, even if you were not a gang member. And so, you were looked at as now becoming the man of the house. That was the next stress. Yeah. Now I'll talk, the son dad or the son husband. Let's kind of talk about that, because that's what happened to a lot of young Black men who became to hate their dads. They became son husbands. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the son husbands are, of course, if we're going to define it literally, they're the biological sons of husbandless women. These are women that sought out independence, that prioritize education, jobs, maybe even welfare, but prioritize a lifestyle where men were not considered necessary. And so in that, what many of those women do is they seek out emotionally from their own sons what they're not getting from partners. Right. And these are the men they're raising, so they can condition them in ways that suit their sensibilities. If you think about it, every mother who tries to teach a son what manhood is, she teaches him manhood based on what she is drawn to, right? What values she likes in men. Now, that's very different from actually showing a young man what a man is. It's just showing him a presentation of what she likes about men. But still, the other side of why she's doing that is it provides her emotional sustenance from a man that she can control. And this is the dynamic that women don't like to admit to, that they do actually need men. They need attention from men. They need interaction from men. This is a human thing. But in many respects, our women don't want to admit to that need. So they produce men that they can get it from. Now, that's the son husband. But one thing that I talk about too is the husband son. These are grown men that are effectively children in relationships. I can tell you a number of white collar, master's degree, PhD degree having women who seek out men that are unemployed. They may be out of prison. They're having difficulty developing a life where they can stand on their own 2 feet. And those women will marry those men, will have kids with those men, divorce them sometimes, but often won't have much respect for them. Those become very useful resources. However, if you're talking about a woman that wants to have kids, that wants to have a family, she may want the presentation of certain things, but those men will reach out to me and complain about how they're being treated behind closed doors. But what they don't often understand is their husband sons. They were brought in because they don't have resources. They were brought in because they can't make decisions over her. They can't change their mind. If anything, these guys don't have a place to go. If they disagree too much and get kicked out of the house, they're on the street. So there's a value to that for some women who would rather have a man they can control rather than a man that they have to actually listen to, deal with, so on and so forth. Some women, particularly successful women, actually look for men who they can control. And often husband sons will be considerably younger, considerably poorer. So they're not in a position to say no or to impose their will on any given situation.
Yeah, we're seeing that, especially like with Keisha Cole, Nico Kale, Erykah Badu. She's 50 with a 27-year-old boyfriend.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
you see it. Tandy Newton, she's dating some like young black dude.
Oh yeah. And one of the things people don't talk about when you look at those relationships long term, in the beginning they're great. For young men, you get this older woman, you have these excellent conversations. Sometimes the sex is really good, but what tends to happen over time is usually for a woman, if you're not able to bring anything to her life, to bring insight, to bring resources, so on and so forth, if you're not able to do that, women tend to process you one of two ways. You're either her child or you're her man. And if you have far less life experience, you have no resources, you don't have things that you can engage her in that she's never done before, everything you come up with, she's already tried several times. You want to take her on a trip, she's already been there. If you got too much of that going on, you end up becoming her son. And you'll notice the sex tends to stop and the conversations and arguments sound like a mother talking to a son. You are now there just so that she's not alone. But in terms of the intimacy, you'll find that that'll die off. And not in every case, of course. But one of the things you notice is these types of relationships fall back into patterns because we as human beings operate in pattern. And as much as people don't want to admit it, that men are sought out for guidance, for resources, for so on and so forth. If you're not able to provide that, you might be a husband, son.
Okay. So let's kind of go back to these black men when their mother has told them about their father. He doesn't want to talk to you. Some of these men actually go out, and what I've noticed when I was coming up in the black community, and I want to get back to my experience, but what I noticed is that this woman would tell her own son, your daddy ain't shit.
Yeah.
That guy would like maybe be struggling for a minute because of the divorce, but it wasn't uncommon to see that guy remarry.
Yeah.
With a beautiful wife.
Yes.
And get a bigger house, a new family. That mother becomes a demon in that guy's life. Right. and tries to destroy everything. And tries to turn, like I say, the son against, his new family, his new wife. Oh, I'm not letting her go over there with that bitch and all that type of stuff. While she is, typically the relationships that she has are always with dudes that are less quality than the original guy who sees the quote unquote deadbeat.
Right.
Now, am I right about that in Black America, or does that happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is one of the things, man. So let me ask you a question, O'Shea.
Mm-hmm.
So you're fairly well-to-do. You're fairly successful. You're out at a club. You see somebody you have no desire to really hang out with or get to know. But as far as you're concerned, she's interested in having sex. You're interested in having sex. You're a young man. You're free. You're not married. She's free. She's not married. You have sex one night. You're good. That was all you really wanted. And you thought it was a mutual agreement, right? But this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of reproductive technology, pharmaceuticals. She has control. She can have sex with previous men, but make sure she doesn't get pregnant from those men. But she wants O'Shea's baby. So what happens when she tells you she's on birth control, whatever? You may even have sex with her a couple of times, but you have no plans on making it permanent. And that doesn't make you a bad person. And that's what, a lot of times we get the story, like, because men don't want to have relationships, they're bad people. No, we all decide to engage in activities without a relationship all the time. But she decided she wanted O'Shea's baby because of your status, because of whatever. She finds you to be, high profile. Now you have this woman that has access to the ability to change the next 18 years of your life, whether you want her to or not. Now, you could have worn a condom, you could have done whatever, but if for any reason none of that works, you are now at the whim of her decision making. And you never wanted a family with her. You didn't even want to be in a relationship with her. This is one of the things I talk about in the article that I wrote, because the difficulty is the way we see our mothers. They're on pedestals. This is the woman that raised you. This is the woman that suckled you at her breast. You don't want to see her as a club jump off. You don't want to see her as somebody that isn't valuable, because all you know is she birthed you and raised you. But the reality is that may not be the relationship she had with your father. And for grown men, and this is why I wrote the article to Generation X Men, I'm saying you're now the father. Think about the woman you met at the club, whether you had kids with her or not. Think about how you would feel if she made a decision and you may have slipped up and made a mistake. And now there's a permanent, life being that came out of that she brought into the world by her whim. And you had very little choice other than what took place the night you had sex. So you had a lot of men in the 60s and the 70s who ended up with children that they never necessarily wanted. But the old belief, was that you married her and you took care of her and so on and so forth. But again, when you talk about the pill, when you talk about birth control, now women can pick and choose a lot more than they could before. And now this whole question of Roe versus Wade, we might be going back to an era where women don't have as much control over their bodies as they used to. And the problem with that is now they might be stuck with babies for men they don't want. But when they come across an O'Shea, the likelihood she's going to give that baby up. I mean, on one end, she might be in love with you or think she's in love with you, or it might just be your paycheck. You make a lot of money. Why would she give that baby up? So the point I'm getting at, and this is something that comedian Patrice O'Neal talked about, you have to get to a point where you understand your mother is your father's woman. He didn't use that language, but you get the point. And if you haven't got to the point where you understand that, you'll continue to valorize, you'll continue to pedestalize your mother and not see her as a human being, as a woman. If you understand that your mother, what she was to your father, is what your woman has been to you, then you can kind of sit back and stand in your father's shoes a little bit and look at it from a different vantage point. And it may be a hard pill to swallow to realize that you may not have been wanted, or hell, even sometimes the way you were introduced is a problem. How many men talk about a woman that brought a baby years later, and sometimes may even want retroactive child support on a child he didn't even know about?
Right.
He's a happy family. He's married. He's built the family he's dreamed about with the woman he chose. The woman he engaged for a short period of time is demanding presence in his life, demanding resources, and demanding emotional support for a child he may not have even known about. We don't get to talk about that side of it because it's not politically correct. And, so we're shamed and said we're men are told that they're bad men. But the reality is, women don't have to really experience it the same way men do. So, men don't have as much control over, what takes place in a family in that kind of manner. So I was trying to say to men, look, understand your father, even if you're emotionally hurt, understand the circumstances of the time, understand the impact of the policies, understand how your life may have mirrored his in some respects, and then sit down and have a conversation, not necessarily as father and son, but as men. Sit down and have a conversation with your father as a man and say, all right, tell me what happened. And you may find out He's nowhere near as guilty as even I've been saying in the last few minutes. It may not even be that. He may have been lied to from day one. You don't know that. But if you've ever been in a relationship and you've had a woman do you dirty, I'm not saying women do this because they're horrible creatures. They're human.
Right.
You know, men and women can do each other dirty. That's a human thing. But we don't associate women with that in what do you call it, in polite company. We don't do that because it's considered uncouth. But the reality is they do. And some men have been done dirty, have been lied about. You've been raised on a steady stream of lies. And it's not till you sit down with them and find out, there's a whole different side to this that you never considered because you didn't process that your mother was his woman. Very different relationship.
Let me talk about, because you make a great point about in the Black community, even in Africa, there is, a real good love for, it's kind of not always a matriarchal society, but I do see where we get that from, and it's part of, our innate culture, maybe from Africa in a sense. But I have witnessed that in the Black community, Black mothers have somewhat of a Christology associated, if you will. They're messianic in a way. And so how does that play into a man believing everything despite he sees his mother making mistakes all the time, maybe? How does that play into the Black male psyche and wanting to forgive his father because of that sort of equivalent Christology kind of thing?
It's really a lot more fraught than people would think, and a lot of this is going to depend on the training of the person you ask. I mean, I see it. I come at it a little differently. I do recognize that you have matriarchal traditions on the continent, that some of which has been maintained to some extent, but I'm really one of those people that talks about the impact of policy on that, and why. And here's the reason I do that. If you look at a piece, a paper written in the 1980s by Errol Miller, and he talks about the Black family in Jamaica. One of the things he says at the very early part of the paper, and I did a whole show on this and we read through the paper, but he talked about the very specific ethnic groups that were predominant in Jamaica they actually came from patriarchal communities in the African continent. But we wouldn't know that because there's been such a major policy shift that prioritized women and put them in a position of authority, that whether you came from a matriarchal lineage or a patriarchal one, the society you were in radically shifted it. You know what I mean? So when you looked at Jamaica in the 1980s, in terms of what he was talking about, he actually showed you over a century worth of data as to how women were prioritized, how they were put into positions of authority, and how that changed the family dynamic, even though they hailed from patriarchal countries. He actually showed you how patriarchal men were sort of socially demoted. And I think much the same thing happened in the US. So I'm not going to say that Africa becomes completely irrelevant in terms of patriarchy or matriarchy, but I will say, I think policy, contemporary policy for its time over the last century and more, has had a lot more to do with shaping the social roles we play and placing women in positions of authority. Because you have to remember, especially if you come from any country that engaged in enslavement, the women had closer proximity with white men. They had different relationships. Black men and white men did not relate. We didn't relate well. And to the extent that we dealt with white women, we always did so under the threat of death. Right? White women weren't in positions of authority. If she was caught having sex with a black man, she might be socially punished. You might be lynched. But when it came to white men and black women weren't lynched for having sex with white slave owner, white men. They weren't. I mean, they may be ignored at worst, or he may decide to give her little baubles and trinkets at different points in time. But my point here is that there was a different relationship. So if white men were in positions of power, especially through enslavement, the one you had with black women was authorized by white men. What you had with white women happened under the table when it came to black men. Or there was complete disassociation. I mean, there are whole periods in time we could talk about where white women, through policy, through whatever they could, attacked black men over and over again, especially in regard to voting. So there's a very different history in relation to white society that black men and black women deal with, because we had different relationships with different people. But at the end of the day, white men were in a position of authority. So black women had a different relationship with them. And so when
Mm-hmm.
we start to talk about who gets resources, who is placed in a position to make decisions for the family and the community, it's not Black men.
So let me kind of go back to this, Kevin Samuels, because I see a lot of ladies, because you have some guys getting tattoos of Kevin Samuels, and so people are, and you guys don't have a father, you guys are fatherless, and I mean that's without question. We already know that, now maybe as much as 80 or more percent of Black children are growing up without the father there at all. But I think what happened in the Kevin Samuels era was a lot of men waking up to, and you talked about it in our previous video, their own sexual marketplace value, their own personal value. And so a lot of guys started to look at, well, listen, I'm not here to just be a cog to take care of my mom and be her son husband, or I'm not just here to get rich and then help my sisters and everybody else out, or fight for her when she gets in the situation with her ghetto ass boyfriend. No, I have values too, and people need to read. Not only Black women can have standards, I get to have standards, and there are things that you need to do to come up to my level if I have a certain level of achievement. Sure. And you start. All these Black men trend with this high value thing, and I kind of want. I mean, in your tenure, studying Black masculinity studies, have you ever seen this sort of trend in the Kevin Samuels era? Black men waking up like this, and why do you think that was?
I've never seen it. But I think one of the reasons that is because, again, when you're talking about a group of men who are overwhelmingly raised by mothers, one, we were not taught that we had value. Whether you're talking about intrinsic value, whether you're talking about sexual marketplace value, we weren't taught we had value. We were taught that you had to serve. You had to find a woman, pedestalize her, treat her well. I mean, if you listen to the love songs in the 80s and 90s, that told you how men were socialized, Black men in particular. We were given a certain amount of value based on our willingness to serve and please women, even down to sex. And I think I've talked about this on your show before. They've done studies on this. Most groups of men, you're talking about 5 to 10 minutes worth of sex. When I was coming up, the standard for Black men was 2 and 3 hours, right? And you had to learn all these different things to please a woman, because the base sensibility was that as a Black man, your value, if any, was in how well you served. You weren't told that you had value that would require her to do something for you. So when you get the rise of the manosphere, you get the rise of this concept of sexual marketplace value, and it's backed by data. Going to data clisms, Christian Rudder's book, and you see over 1 million different couplings. And there's empirical data to frame men's and women's dating and mating choices. That is something we were not taught about. So now you have young Black men and older Black men who are finding out in their 40s that they actually have value, and that they didn't have value at a young age, and that tends to grow with status and so on and so forth. Those things are new ideas for us, because that's not what we were taught. We were taught that we were supposed to serve. And so to turn around and say, hey, now there are things you need to do for me. You need to tell me what exactly you bring. Well, one of the reasons Black women in particular are so hostile to that is that's not what they were told. They were told that they were queens and goddesses. They were told that they were high profile simply because they existed, and men would have to serve simply because that's what men were supposed to do. Well, now men are saying, no, that's not what I'm supposed to do. And you're actually supposed to tell me why I should choose you. You're supposed to actually engage me and compete for me. And that's a whole nother component to this. Black women were never taught that they need to compete for men. They were taught that they deserved a man because they existed. And we were raised by women that taught us that we were supposed to find a woman to serve. So if you put those two things together, she doesn't have to do anything. You have to qualify yourself to her. You have to almost audition for her time. And so when men decide to shift that, and it's inevitable that it's going to happen. Look, in any society, whatever we value tends to be rare, right? That's what determines something's value. Well, the reality is Black men in number were already rare. There are more Black women than men. And then when you add into that income, when you add into that status, when you add into that accomplishment, when you add into that whatever qualities we deem valuable, whatever they are, they don't even have to be materialistic. If you're in a community that values spiritual consciousness, well, that's still going to be rare. And so so the man who has it is still going to have options as long as that is the base situation, no matter what the metric is. Then women are going to have to learn to compete for men. And this is something many of them resent because they were taught that men must compete for them, despite that their numbers don't make them rare. And it doesn't jive for a lot of them. So a lot of them, they have a lot of hostility for it. They claim to walk away. They claim to divest. But the reality is, a lot of them can't. And so there's a lot of reconciling that has to happen if there's going to be any reconciling at all. And that's the question.
Dr. Chinsan Johnson, I definitely thank you for coming on and giving us another wonderful show. I stayed up. It's like almost 4:45 a.m. Polish time. He's on the West Coast. Wanted to deliver this, guys, to you. You guys are asking for me to bring Dr. Chinsan Johnson, and with our brother passing, Kevin Samuels, I'm trying to work overtime to bring you guys. I can never replace a man like that, but we're doing our very best as a unit to try to give you guys the value of information from our best people. Doc, tell them why they should subscribe to you.
And go over to Dr. T. Hassan Johnson on YouTube, look up the Onyx Report, subscribe, join, support the show. You can also go to Institute for BlackMaleStudies.com. You can support on Patreon for the Institute or the Onyx Report, but you can take classes on the Institute website or catch free interviews. And one interview I have there with Mr. Kevin Samuels about his entire life might be of use to you. And there's also an Institute for Black Male Studies YouTube page with a lot of those interviews there as well. So support and any of those you choose to do. And I appreciate you in advance.
All right. Give him a round of applause. And so, guys, I really thank you so much for your attention today. You can check out Dr. Chinsan Johnson at the first comment pinned to the top. And guys, as you know, the buffoonery remains at all-time high. We're out.